Hi, everyone. Today we are talking about the economics of war, and this is a subject that gets little to no coverage in the media, but it's a subject that can make people a lot of money if they understand how it works. So, typically speaking, a nation's economy undergoes certain changes during periods of war, and understanding what those changes are and how to capitalize on them can make you rich and has made people rich for centuries. So, we're going to go into this not necessarily because I want you to try to be an opportunist and capitalize off of war, but whether you like it or not, war changes a nation's economy, and you are either going to be wealthier or poorer as a result of war. It is at least the very least I could do would be to give you this information so that you can learn for yourself. So check it out. It's a great one. Now, if you're interested in learning more about this subject, we have a course. It's called Economics Easy for Everyone. The most common bachelor's degree amongst billionaires and multimillionaires is a bachelor's degree in economics. And the reason for this is because understanding how the economy works allows you to advance oftentimes in terms of wealth and in terms of your career. It's similar to like playing chess, for example. How can you expect yourself to win at chess if you don't know how the pieces move? And in a similar way, how can you expect to get ahead if you don't understand the forces shaping your paycheck, your job prospects, and your life? Economics Easy for Everyone does that. It's a great course. It's changing lives, so definitely check it out. But anyways, here is a brief overview of our economics of war. A way to think about war is look at the spider web. Think of the spider web as the economy. In this web or in this economy, everything is interconnected and it's woven together beautifully. So when war happens, it's as if there is a pierced hole in that web. And I'm going to show you this image of a pierced hole. So you see a spider web with some holes in it. And what happens is not only is there a hole in that web, but there's also new connections that are made that weren't previously made. You see certain lines of the spider web connecting slightly differently. And in a way, that's a way to think of the economy when a nation is at war. New financial arrangements are made, supply chains are disrupted, resource prices change, currencies devalued. A lot of changes are happening. And you can either learn this information, know it, be aware of it, and use it to make smart investments and protect yourself against any kind of financial vulnerability, or you can ignore it. But either way, war is going to impact you financially. It impacts everyone. So war guarantees that a country and that country's society will either do better or worse economically, but they won't stay the same. So today what we're doing is we're talking about what some of the wealthiest people in the world do during war, the types of investments they make, and we're going to go through the logic behind some of these investments. Whenever a country is about to go to war or is at war, you see huge changes in the stock market because big things are happening. Wealthy people are moving their money around. Investors are trying to position themselves to make the most money. So one of the first impacts that war has on a nation's economy is it disrupts that nation's supply chain, because going to war restricts access to certain raw materials or it limits the movement of goods across borders. Typically speaking, investors who capitalize on companies that provide solutions to supply chain issues, such as local sourcing, shipping, logistics, or raw material alternatives, make a ton of money. For instance, during World War II, international trade was severely disrupted. As a result, companies that pivoted to local production or secured alternative supply sources thrived in the absence of imports. Another impact of war, which often doesn't get that much coverage, is a lot of technological advancements and spin-offs are made. And what happens is during times of war, countries invest even more heavily in research and development, not to benefit their people, but typically to win the war. As a result of a lot of this research and development, though, there are innovations and breakthroughs that are made much more frequently, especially when it comes to technological advancements as well as medical care advancements. So typically the wealthy, what they would do is they would keep their ears open to innovations that are occurring as a result of the war, especially medical innovations and technological innovations. They were typically much more likely to invest in companies that would then in turn incorporate a lot of this new technology into whatever they did. Oftentimes the wealthy, as a result of this, got wealthier, and it's no surprise why. Military projects, it's very important to look at military projects when thinking about new technology and what to invest in for the future. Military projects have a great history of producing breakthrough technologies like the internet and GPS. They were both military projects initially, and they later became indispensable to modern commerce. And really, they impact how our lives are run, as well as how much of our economy works. And the early adopters of this, the early adopters of the internet, investing in companies that incorporated internet technology into their business or GPS technology into their business, those were the ones that really won out over time. Another thing to look out for is large fluctuations in commodities and natural resources. And there's a few reasons for this. One is during times of war, countries go into debt in order to pay for the war. And when you go into debt, sometimes too much money floods the market and your currency devalues. So commodities like gold, silver, they tend to increase in price because the value of the dollars that are available go down. Being aware of this at all times is very important, but it's especially important to be aware of this and be very open to investing in commodities and natural resources during times of war. Inflation happens during war oftentimes. And during inflation, there's a specific playbook, and we have a document. It's a great document online that can give you the inflation playbook of what to do, where to invest, what to look to during times of inflation. And so I would definitely recommend if the country, after this lecture is recorded, if our country or another country you're involved with goes into war, to read that document and act accordingly. And there's definitely winners and losers when it comes to inflation. Back to what I said about inflation, foreign exchange and currency markets experience instability, with some currencies depreciating significantly while others, typically those of countries that didn't get involved in the war, strengthening. Investors who understand how war affects foreign exchange markets can position themselves to profit from these fluctuations. If you want to invest in the currency market, it wouldn't be a bad idea to invest in currencies from countries that are not involved in any war conflict, as they will most likely grow significantly stronger over time. And you may be more open to shorting the currency of the countries that are at war, as their currencies are highly likely every time, almost every single time, to devalue. Now, if you're an entrepreneur, pay attention to medical and healthcare innovations, as we talked about earlier. Entrepreneurs in the healthcare sector can benefit from the increased funding for medical research that often happens during wars because countries want to figure out how to get their men healthier again. Entrepreneurs who invest in the healthcare sector, especially in areas like pharmaceuticals, medical devices, or healthcare services, they do really well during the war. Next thing is the obvious one, the defense and security sector growth. I don't want to talk about this one too much because it's a no-brainer. Military contractors do really well during periods of not being at war, and they do spectacularly well during periods of a nation being at war. It's an easy investment opportunity, but usually if you're trying to invest in military contractors, it'd be wise to invest in these military contractors if you anticipate a war coming, as opposed to after a war already breaks out, as the demand for those stocks will already be saturated by that point. Now on to the most common thing that wealthy people tend to invest in during periods of war, and that is real estate. Believe it or not, real estate is very profitable during periods of war, and for reasons that might surprise you. As discussed a second ago, when a nation is at war, their currency devalues, and as a result, real estate prices tend to go up. Those who invest in real estate early and other safe haven investments do very well for themselves. The financial benefit for those who do so can be astounding, and it's a fairly safe investment additionally. And it's safe because you're never going to see deflation during a period of war for a country. It's only inflation. So during periods of inflation, real estate is a great sector to invest in because the dollar will become weaker and the price for that home or whatever real estate property you are investing in is only going to go nothing but up. It's not just investing in real estate in the parties that are at war. Unlike other investments like currency investments, there is a significant impact upon real estate prices from countries that aren't at war and that are deemed safe from the conflict, as they oftentimes see their property values rise due to demand from expatriates, refugees, and businesses that decide to relocate from war-torn areas to other countries. A classic example of this is real estate markets in Switzerland and Singapore have historically benefited from their reputations as safe havens during periods of war. If you notice a common theme, during periods of war, oftentimes the wealthiest people benefit, but not all the time. So what I'd like to do here is I'm going to go over some wars, and we're going to go into some economic history of what happened to different parties, i.e. countries that were involved in these wars, because it's pretty fascinating. And what you're going to notice here are some very consistent themes. So let's talk about the World War II's impact upon the United States' economy. The United States obviously was the big winner during World War II. And when the United States entered the war in 1941, it was still grappling with the Great Depression. But war changed everything for America as federal spending surged from $9 billion in 1940 to over $100 billion by 1945. This occurred because America was busy building tanks, planes, ships, and guns, and all things related like steel, rubber, oil. During this time period, the United States economy exploded by around 72% during the war. Unemployment virtually disappeared during this period. It went from 14.6% in 1940, which is an astounding number, to 1.2% by 1944, which is an equally astounding number. And during this time period, during World War II, it was a very special period. American manufacturing was becoming much more efficient. And not only was America supplying itself with weapons it needed, it was selling supplies to allies around the world for all of their war efforts as well. These other countries, these allies we were selling to, they would oftentimes finance this by debt or devaluing their currency, but it only made America richer. All told, by the end of World War II, the United States had an estimated 50% of the world's total GDP, as well as 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. So clearly, the United States was the big winner of World War II, and they were the biggest economic winner in the history of all wars. From another perspective, the Soviet Union also benefited from their victory during World War II, but they also bore the brunt of human loss. They lost 27 million Soviets, and during the war, unlike the United States, Soviet Union's GDP actually fell by about 25%. After the war, though, the USSR's economy rapidly recovered, partly due to reparations extracted from defeated Germany and the absorption of Eastern European economies into the Soviet bloc. At that time, the Soviet Union emerged kind of as a superpower, and overall, it was a strange kind of victory. Japan, on the other hand, Japan lost, and not only did they lose, 2 atomic bombs vaporized entire cities of theirs. Industrial production collapsed, and it was very devastating to Japan as a whole. However, Japan managed to turn its defeat into an economic miracle. By the 1950s, the country transformed itself into a technology and manufacturing powerhouse, thanks in at least part to United States financial support and a retooled and more efficient economy. Now, a country that would not be good to invest in during that time period was Great Britain. While they were on the winning side, they also experienced huge declines in their economy. Now, let's look at some individuals that won from World War II, because you can look at countries and that says a lot about where to invest and where not to. But there were some individuals that really made a lot of money during World War II. One is Henry J. Kaiser, who was a shipbuilding magnate. Kaiser became the father of modern American shipbuilding. His company churned out the famous Liberty ships, which were cargo ships crucial to the Allied effort. After the war, Kaiser parlayed his wealth into building an actual healthcare empire, founding Kaiser Permanente. Overall, war made this man fabulously wealthy. Another winner from World War II was the DuPont family. The DuPont company specialized in chemicals and explosives, and they were a major producer of explosives and chemicals during World War II. The company's profits tripled during the war, and post-war, the company eventually diversified into making plastics, pharmaceuticals, and other industries. That said, war for the DuPont family was extremely lucrative. Now, when it comes to innovation during World War II, IBM developed a lot of advanced technology for the United States military, including many of the country's early computing systems. This caused the company's sales to double between 1939 and 1945. Standard Oil and Royal Dutch Shell were critical to the war efforts and were rewarded as the war caused a surge in demand for oil, which enriched these companies. Post-war, these oil giants continued to expand globally as the world rebuilt and demand for energy exploded. Now let's look at a different war for some context. The Napoleonic Wars were interesting. And so many people don't understand the context behind the Napoleonic Wars, so I'm going to provide a little bit. By the late 18th and early 19th century, Europe was economically interconnected through trade, and global empires such as France, Britain, and Spain depended on their colonies for wealth. The Napoleonic Wars, they shattered this system as blockades, tariffs, and shifting alliances disrupted traditional trade routes. The British Empire, for example, was the dominant naval power and relied heavily on trade, particularly with its colonies and its growing industrial sector. France, under Napoleon, though, aimed to weaken Britain economically through the Continental System, which was a blockade designed to cut off British trade with Europe. War is often depicted in history as a purely political or military event. However, behind the battlefield maneuvers and strategies lies an intricate web of economic forces. So the Napoleonic Wars, they ravaged Europe for over a decade, but they also stimulated significant economic shifts. Think of it this way. War was a double-edged sword. It drained resources, destroyed infrastructure, and led to social unrest. But for others, it created a tremendous economic opportunities. It spurred technological innovation, created new industries, and even enriched specific individuals and corporations significantly. So through the Napoleonic Wars, there was an increased demand for manufactured goods. These manufactured goods were mainly arms, uniforms, food supplies, and military equipment. But the reason why I bring up the Napoleonic Wars, and the most interesting part about the Napoleonic Wars, was the impact they had on dismantling this aristocratic land-based wealth. So, some context, before the Napoleonic Wars, much of Europe's wealth and power were concentrated into the hands of aristocratic elites. These elites derived their wealth primarily from land, agricultural estates passed down through generations, alongside feudal rents, tithes, and taxation. Their economic model was built on a collection of rents from the peasants and tenant farmers, which was a system that functioned for centuries. However, the Napoleonic Wars upended this, and they upended it in a few ways. First off, they destroyed the estates of these wealthy individuals. The Napoleonic Wars caused widespread devastation, particularly in regions affected by military campaigns like Spain, Italy, Prussia, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, which is present-day Germany. Aristocratic estates were often burned, looted, or even simply rendered useless as peasants fled or were conscripted into armies. In particular, many German states were ravaged by the constant movement of armies, significantly reducing agricultural productivity. There was also a displacement of labor. The heavy toll of conscription upon the Napoleonic Wars pulled millions of men into armies, which left the estates and fields of the aristocracy without adequate labor. As peasants and rural workers were mobilized for military service or migrated to cities for industrial jobs, the landlords were faced with labor shortages that made it difficult to sustain agricultural output and therefore wealth. Also, there was the impact of Napoleon's blockade to cut off Britain from European markets. This severely impacted trade across the continent. Agricultural export markets for goods such as grain and wine were disrupted, and in many cases, aristocratic landowners lost their primary sources of income from selling surplus crops to international markets. In the long run, one of the reasons why the Napoleonic Wars was so transformational was because of the technological innovation that arose due to the constant demand for military supplies and the pressures of war, which spurred this technological innovation, particularly in ironworks, steam engines, and shipbuilding. This led to the rise of entrepreneurs like Matthew Boulton and James Watt, who capitalized on these demands by producing steam engines not only for industrial purposes, but for naval warfare as well. These industrial capitalists built the factories and infrastructure that would define the coming industrial age. There was also more capital investment in industry. Wealth that might have once been tied up in land or traditional sectors was now being directed into factories and industrial enterprises. Merchants and financiers saw the war as an opportunity to expand production capacity and innovate. For example, the ironworks industry in regions like Birmingham and the north of England expanded rapidly during this time to meet the growing military demand. Cotton mills, too, became central to the war economy, particularly in supplying textiles for military uniforms. The wars also led to the rise of bankers and financial capitalists, as the Napoleonic Wars were a watershed moment for the emergence of financiers who dealt in government bonds, war loans, and international credit networks. The Rothschild family, in particular, took advantage of this chaotic wartime conditions to become one of the wealthiest and most powerful banking dynasties in history. Then there's the Korean War. So the Korean War had some interesting impacts. So from South Korea's perspective, the war caused a reduction in GDP by about 80%, plummeting from $2.2 billion in 1950 to just $450 million by 1953. South Korea's per capita income dropped from $87 to $64 during the same period. Essentially, their economy was devastated. The Vietnam War. So many of you may not realize this, but for the United States, the Vietnam War had disastrous consequences upon our country's economy. And they were disastrous. First off, there was the cost of the war. The Vietnam War cost the United States an estimated $186 billion, which is around $1 trillion in today's dollars. And this led to significant budget deficits. The sheer expense drained public coffers and led to an increase in borrowing and inflation. By 1968, the United States was spending $2 billion per month on the war. The massive fiscal pressure contributed to a phenomenon called stagflation in the 1970s. Now, stagflation, for those of you who don't remember or it was before your time, like it was before my time, stagflation was a time period of stagnant economic growth accompanied with inflation. And it was a particularly devastating time period for all those who lived through it. And it was largely driven by the Vietnam War. Our country, the United States, nearly went bankrupt. So the Vietnam War seemed devastating, but who got rich from this? Defense contractors, first off, got rich. Companies like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Bell Helicopter, and Raytheon reaped enormous benefits during the Vietnam War, thanks to massive demand for military equipment. Construction companies also. Brown and Root, a construction firm that later became part of Dick Cheney's former firm, Halliburton, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but during the Iraq War, Halliburton was very controversial. Anyways, this firm won numerous contracts to build American military bases in Vietnam, and their profits soared as a result of this. Another winner of the war were companies of raw materials. Companies supplying raw materials such as steel and oil saw profits rise due to increased demand from defense manufacturers. For instance, U.S. Steel benefited as the production of tanks, ships, and planes ramped up. So there you have it. It's the economics of war. This is a brief preview. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Anyways, thanks for watching, and we'll keep you posted.